Hello, this is Chris Goldthorpe with www.chesschesschess.com, and this is a video about the Najdorf variation of the Sicilian defense, which looks like this. Now, since this video is going to be for players who are just barely strong enough to play it, maybe playing it for the first time, there's a few things you should make sure that you know about the Sicilian. Black wants to trade his C pawn for white's D pawn. And white doesn't always mind because he may feel that what he gets from that exchange is worth it. But this pawn on C5, make no mistake, if you are the player of the black pieces, you will capture at D4 if white gives you any opportunity. You want to use an open C file. One of the results of that is that black will have what we call a central majority. We're going to see that again in a minute. Now, there are naturally other ways, what I might call system openings, that white could use that are actually not that bad, mostly closed Sicilian systems, which means the white D pawn and the black C pawn don't trade for each other. But we can learn to play the open Sicilian. Most people, even in scholastic chess, they do play the open Sicilian if they know anything about it. Now, black makes this move not to guard the C pawn and not to let the bishop out, although it does let the bishop out. Black plays this move to keep this pawn from moving forward without control, so that he can put his king's knight on this square, which he expects to do because this knight needs to get out of the way so black can castle, and that's the best defensive position for a knight as well. So he's going to use a rook on the c-file, so black doesn't expect to castle queenside. Now, it is true, since I say we should always look at checks and captures, this is actually a variation by white, and it's not that bad. If you play the white pieces, you can play this, and then white castles very soon afterward, and you can get a decent opening. You may still play it as an open Sicilian with d4, but I just wanted to show you that as a result of opening up this diagonal, it does give white another opportunity to take the opening in a direction you might not be familiar with. This is the most popular move, and of course, if you're the black pieces, yes, you're going to take that. But white also has an open file now, and white now has the only pawn that actually is in the center, even though it's not defended. Also, white's knight here at d4 is a little closer to white's king than any of black's pieces are to white's king or even the center. So white is going to do this. Now, because black has a central majority, black would now like to trade his d pawn for white's e pawn, something white will not cooperate with. Because if that happens, then black could, as you see indicated here, eventually play e5, and his position would be fine. He's turned the tables on white if white's e-pawn is gone. So, for that reason, it's usually said for the Sicilian, if you can safely play the move d5, you're usually at least equal and maybe better. So, for that reason, white often likes to get this arrangement of his pawns. It's called the Maroczy bind, named after Geza Maroczy. However, that weakens d4, keeps the bishop from ever taking a post on this diagonal anytime soon. So by attacking white's e-pawn now with the knight, this is white's best move, but as you can see, it blocks c4. However, white has two pieces developed to black's one, but black has no real weaknesses, and white has to spend more moves to get to white than black does to get, I mean, white has to spend more moves to get to black than black does to get to white. Black can use his c-file pretty quickly. He'll often try to put pressure on c5, I mean c6. So, if black were to move here, this would be the dragon variation, maybe a subject for a later video. This is the Scheveningen variation, and this would be the so-called classical variation, which gets confused with the Sicilian four knights, where these two pawns are on the white squares instead. And this is the Najdorf variation, the subject of this video. So, why would black make this move where he just moves another pawn? He did not develop a piece. Well, control of b5 is certainly going to be useful for black, as it keeps knights and bishops from coming to that square. Next, by this pawn being here, black may move his pawn to b4, I mean to b5, and get ready to go to b4, where he might dislodge this knight that's guarding his center. Meanwhile, by clearing this b7 square, it will allow the bishop to hit e4, and then black will usually do something like this and like this with his knights. So, by temporarily delaying development, he's going to see where white puts his pieces. But black has to always keep this in mind, that he is behind on development and must be careful, especially of sacrificial tactics on f7 and on e6. Okay, this is the main line, just barely. What that means is most top players would regard this to be the best move. Now, we're going to come back to that, of course, but let's look at a few other possibilities. And there are many. This is probably the most common alternative, bishop g5. Naturally, black is going to move his e-pawn, or he would have already played g6 and gone into the dragon variation, where this a6 move might represent a loss of time because he'd go to a5 in one shot, especially if white castles queenside. So the e-pawn's going to move, and this bishop will be pinning this knight. White even has ideas of moving from f2 to f4 and then moving this pawn up, putting more pressure on the knight. Sometimes that forces black to go here, but he may have the idea of attempting to tear up the king side. Also, sometimes in this opening, black will voluntarily let his pawns be doubled here, like this, and then this e-pawn will go to e7, and the king will be tucked inside, especially if he's been traded away somehow. So, now the knight is pinned, but black is ready to develop his bishop, which would leave him ready to castle, which will hide his king and get his rook active. From here we have this variation as well as this one, which gets the queen out a little faster. The f4 helps white to try to eventually play the break e5. Another alternative to the bishop g5 move, rather than just bishop e3, which, as I said, is the main line. Another alternative is bishop e2, which gets a similar move, e5. So I've seen people go here, knight f3. It's really not good, though. It's very helpful for white to get the f2, f4 move in when he can. But of course the knight is under attack. So white has spent 1, 2, 3 moves to move a knight from the king side all the way over to the queen side. The position of the knights is a little more important than the bishops because bishops are long-range pieces. Notice that both of white's bishops reach onto both sides of the board simultaneously. Black will only have one bishop like that. He goes here first because he really wants to castle quite soon. White can castle short, in which chance white has to be careful of pins along this diagonal here, the A7 G1 diagonal. Once he does this, you'll often see king to H1 and you'll wonder why is he doing that, and it's because he wants to play F4, but he may have pieces that can be attracted to D4, and then a bishop goes to C5 and like pins a queen to the king or something like that. So that's why we'll often see white play king H1, and there it is, almost automatically. He wants to keep his E pawn guarded because he's going to go to D5 with his D pawn when he can anyway. And white is willing to just let that be solid, even to block his bishop, just to keep E4 very solid. He's pinning all his hopes on the center. And then sometimes you'll see them do like this and like this in order to attack, or the rook move to the G file. Okay, bishop E6. Again, aiming at playing D6 to D5 like this. Knight D5. And anyway, this all came from this variation where the next move was to do E5 and knight, and then knight to B3. That's a little similar to the main line here, bishop E3. So it's kind of like after you elect to play the Najdorf with A6, if white's next move is a bishop move to the E file, you play E5 and the knight goes to B3. So let's look at a couple other things that white can do after you elect the Najdorf variation. This is one that Fischer made rather popular. They call it the Sozin, S-O-Z-I-N variation. And the idea is after black castles to pin this pawn and use his F-pawn to get all the way to F5 and with the bishop and maybe some other pieces help to attack E6 and either open the diagonal and or the F file. Black does have a good defensive bulwark here with these two pawns side by side, both of them supported by bishops at least, and in the case of the E-pawn by another pawn as well. That keeps the bishop from being hit by B5, where black could continue with B4, make the knight move, grab the E-pawn. Okay, now white has an opportunity, if he wanted to play A3, and it would keep this from happening. But just castling is what you'll get more often, and it's actually a better move for white. So let's prepare ourselves for better moves. Bishop E7 is simple enough. You don't have to worry about the knight going here because this knight's still guarding it. Queen F3. It may look like E5 is a big threat, but if I move here, well, actually it is, because white has 1, 2, 3 pieces there, and only the E-pawn of black's guards D5. So white puts a little more pressure on E5. Now the queen adds its weight to that square. So the queen comes here where the G-pawn will be pinned after black castles to guard it. Okay, and then we'll usually see a move like this. back. The knight goes back where it can't be messed with. Also, the black bishop can go to f6 to help guard, and black may move his king to h8 as long as he has g7 here sufficiently guarded. Okay, gets one more piece out, and white, oh, that's where we ended. Okay, here's another move that white can try after you play your Najdorf variation, that is f4. Okay, they go e5, knight f3, and this is the move I would recommend. Remember, this bishop very often is going to go to b7, almost sort of a fianchetto. And that move is designed to make b5 more difficult, and it does do that. However, b4 is potentially available later on for, to pin the knight or to go here and check. If I'm white, I really don't like to cut off the queen's access to d5. And black should develop when they can. White does likewise. Takes, and king h1. See, if the white bishop takes, then the black queen can go here, and that would give check. As I mentioned, this open diagonal can be problematic for white. And then if the bishop was over here instead, then the queen would come down here and capture and threaten the knight as well. So now knight c5, and bishop takes that pawn now, but then white can pin that remaining knight. So f3 is also a move. Now that looks pretty passive, and it seems bad for the white squared bishop, but it's good for the dark squared bishop. And again, this can help white to form the same sort of pawn structure with queenside castling that he does in the Yugoslav variation of the Sicilian dragon. Now, since this is a video, you can go back and hear that again, maybe write it down and Google it if you're interested, but basically involves this triangle like this, and then sometimes the h-pawn with it goes to here and to here, and we advance pawns and therefore open some files against a castled king that way with opposite side castling. So black is going to try to take control of f4 as well. The knight should normally go to this side of the board. Bishop e6, because white has a lot of control of d5 already. Surely black is going to have to make the other bishop come out as well before he castles. And he lines them up, which is typical of these pawns being on white, is that white creates this queen-bishop battery on the black squares. Black castles. White castles queenside. Knight b d7. And g4. See, there we go. White's going to begin the attack as black does. And that's one of the reasons why you might like to play this opening. Maybe your chess trainer told you that he thinks you're good at attack and defense. So when both sides are attacking, we get a lot of tactics. If you're relatively good for your skill level at tactics, particularly king hunts, if you're inspired by players like Mikhail Tal, Garry Kasparov, very tactical attacking players like that, then you may like the Sicilian. It's also a good way for black to play for a win, especially when a draw is as good as a loss, which is a situation you may find yourself in some tournaments. Sometimes you're in a situation where a draw is as good as a win, and that might call for a different opening choice. So he attacks the knight. White and black attacks the knight. He takes one. Well, we'll let you do the research there. And let's look at the main line now. What I would call the main line. Bishop e6. And white is going to just go for the this triangular pawn shape, which usually goes along with castling queenside. Yeah, that's why the queen develops now. Castles, eventually black wants to get this pawn to here and even to f4, or to open the f file with a capture. Castles, knight b to d7, g4, b5, g5. See, this looks very similar. We've fallen into the same position. If he takes, then when you take, you're threatening to take his queen with check. So he takes the pawn. So we take the pawn with the knight. Again, black is going to struggle for d5, but he might play rook c8, hitting the queen, followed by queen c7, and then move the f rook to the d file before he finally pushes it. This is the kind of thing that you can plan for to make a plan. So what I would encourage you to do is to now watch this entire video again when you have a chance. Naturally, because it's a video, you can go back and watch as many variations as you like. I have omitted the names of some of these variations because it's not so important to remember a lot of names anyway. And certainly go onto YouTube and just type in Najdorf Sicilian. Look at the way it's spelled here. And there are many, many good videos. Hopefully you'll count this as one of them. Again, this is Chris Goldthorpe with chesschesschess.com.